At the very broadest level, I do think Americans and particularly policymakers in Washington, including the Biden administration, are happy with the election outcomes in the sense that we know that Yoon Suk-yeol, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol, is a strong supporter and advocate of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. So anyone who's in defense of the alliance will look at this election results positively, and for the most part, we can expect continuity in the U.S.-South Korea alliance in terms of having a positive relationship. That being said, I do think we have to be careful because there's such an expectation that Yoon Suk-yeol is pro-U.S. that you can't assume. So the Biden administration can't assume that. Well, that means that the South Korea is going to sign up to any kind of initiative that the U.S. wants to promote in the Indo-Pacific region, whether that's the Quad or the Quad Plus, whether that's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. South Korea still makes its own decisions, and I think the one thing we have to be careful of is U.S.-China relations. And we are at this inflection point where we have great power competition, and to Professor Victor Cha's point about this being the most important election, I mean, every election is important because it's an opportunity to establish or to reestablish perhaps relations. But I think in this case, it's because we have a U.S. president who's promoting a policy that supports a certain type of order, regional order. I think under President Trump, it was unclear what sort of order he was, or if he was even trying to establish any sort of order. It was very unclear. So whatever agreements are made at that period were not seen as long-lasting, or whether those agreements or treaties or institutions would lock in, that was questionable. But under the Biden administration, because he's such a strong proponent of this liberal international order, we assume that whatever deals are struck, it's something that we would want to see longer term. And of course, some say, well, it's every 4 years you get a new president, so that's one of the problems of the U.S. But I think the Biden foreign policy team is trying to establish standards and rules that can persist down the road. And so they see in President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol a partner to work with in establishing common standards and rules that can establish a rules-based order for the region. But I do want to go back to this point about not assuming that South Korea will do everything that the U.S. hopes it to do, and that's where U.S.-China relations is an important example. I think the Yoon government will be more forthcoming with China. It's going to speak out on issues like human rights or freedom of expression, and in places like Xinjiang or in Hong Kong. I also think that they're not going to be as cautious or timid in pointing out issues that if China is undercutting or undermining South Korean economic or geopolitical interests, I think the Yoon administration will voice those concerns. But that being said, South Korea still has to maintain positive relations with China. First and foremost is the economic relationship. While it may be tempting to get South Korea to decouple from China because shifting investments, shifting research and design and production away from China to other places in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and elsewhere, I think we might see that continue under President Yoon. But to completely decouple from China will be extremely difficult. And so you have companies like Samsung, LG, SK that have a lot of investments in China, and there's going to be competing national interests versus corporate interests. And that's also something that I think the Yoon government is going to have to weigh out. So if we go back to the foreign affairs piece that was put out by Yoon's foreign policy team, they were very cautious in the way they described China. They said they wanted to establish a new type of partnership or relationship. They didn't say that they were going to, break away from China, or they were going to, completely align with the U.S. and confront China head on. That wasn't the language that was used. They were still cautious, and so that's something to remind those in Washington that South Korea still has to navigate between Beijing and Washington, even though we see a pro-U.S. president coming to the Blue House in South Korea. The positive side, because the Yoon team, the foreign policy team, has been very transparent about its foreign policy views, and many of it aligns together with the United States, especially on South Korean involvement or greater involvement in the Indo-Pacific. I think there are already talking points that can be made, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Biden administration comes out with its Indo-Pacific economic framework either just before its trip to Asia or at that time. And so there might be ways on the economic front in terms of talking about technical points about how South Korea might contribute to the Indo-Pacific economic framework. Those are ways of setting up a summit meeting for success. But on the other front, of course, this is so that's the positive, but one of the negative points, and it's already out there, but as South Koreans are aware, Yoon Suk-yeol is very keen in moving the Cheongwade, the Blue House location, or the presidential office to the Ministry of National Defense. And one thing that would require some discussion with the U.S. is things like planning, in terms of coordination between the U.S. and South Korea militaries or command and control. If all these offices are shifting, that's something that you would also want to keep the U.S. updated on. And because it's happening so quickly, I don't know if the Yoon team can be ready to have those sorts of discussions with the United States. If miraculously the Yoon government is able to make this transition, let's say that they do move the presidential office from the Blue House to Yongsan, where the Ministry of National Defense is, and they work together with the U.S. to figure out some of the technical details, like the logistical details, in terms of ensuring that coordination between the U.S. and South Korean militaries are still in place. Then they could announce this in late May, early June, and the U.S. could say that they support this. I don't know if they do or not, so no one should quote me on this. But assuming that the U.S. is supportive of this move, they can make some kind of statement where the U.S. supports this relocation, that it could also be beneficial for command and control between the U.S. and South Korean militaries. But that's a lot to take care of in the next 2-3 months for the transition team. So whether the Yoon government will be ready to make that sort of announcement, or whether the U.S. can support that decision, it remains to be seen. So my guess is that if there is a summit meeting, that they'll focus more on kind of the broad takeaways about the alliance, support for the alliance, engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and they will try to stay away from the concrete, the specifics. And yes, this move, this relocation to Yongsan, I think it's going to take up a lot of bandwidth in the first few weeks of the Yoon administration. So we'll see how that plays into having a major foreign policy event just a few weeks after the inauguration.